Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're here today, a group of atrocity prevention organizations, to urge the Canadian government, to urge Canada to continue the leadership and to mobilize its allies to prevent mass atrocity crimes. As we stand in 2023, we have the highest number of displaced people ever in modern history, over 100 million, recently surged by Russia's invasion in Ukraine. We see internal conflicts happening in Ethiopia, now in Sudan, across Africa, the Middle East, in important countries. Canada has shown leadership in the past in helping develop a human security agenda and the formulation of the Responsibly Protect doctrine, which says that countries have a responsibility to help other countries prevent and interdict mass atrocity crimes, which include genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. I think we're at a very important stage of global affairs. Canada has recently lowered its overseas development budget, and we're not investing in our military or ODA in our defense budgets at a time when we see atrocity crimes being carried out against civilians globally. In particular, my colleagues and I at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies are concerned that as we currently are speaking to you today, we see atrocity crimes being carried out against the Uyghurs in China. We also have seen war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine by the Russian government. And we're very, very concerned that not only has the UN Security Council been paralyzed in the last few years to stop and interdict mass atrocity crimes, but now we have two members of the UN Security Council, Russia and China itself, that are actually carrying out atrocity crimes both within and outside their borders. So this is a very troubling time. And I think it's a call for Canada and its allies in Europe, in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East to work together to try to stop the changing of the international liberal order, which is detrimental to human rights, detrimental to democratic norms and rules, and detrimental to the UN Charter itself. So with that, I would like now to pass the floor to Savita, who's the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect.
Good morning, everyone, and just echoing Kyle's words that Canada has been a leader in the field of human rights. It has been a norm entrepreneur. Canada's role in development of the UN peacekeeping, the development of the norm of responsibility to protect, and other developments which are about protecting and preventing atrocity crimes and protecting humanity from the most heinous crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity has been written about, has been recorded, and we've been very, very thankful for Canada's leadership on all of these different issues. Right now we are living in a world where over 100 million people are displaced because of atrocities and conflict around the world. And now is the time that we need leadership from countries which value human rights. And Canada has a proven track record of doing that. Canada has been home to refugees, escaping from really horrible situations for many, many years. So we urge again the Canadian Foreign Ministry, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian government to continue to provide this leadership, to be really consistent in their engagement within the multilateral forums, to raise the voice to raise their voice in support of the most vulnerable around the world. And with that, we thank you for your time.
I would now like to invite Chris Tuckwood, who's the founder and executive director of the Sentinel Project, a genocide prevention organization in Toronto, Canada.
Yes, thank you. So we at the Sentinel Project come at this from the perspective of what can we do as an organization to directly assist the people around the world who are threatened by mass atrocities. We place a big emphasis on cooperating with people in the people who are actually in harm's way, and doing what we can to ideally prevent that kind of violence from occurring, or at least mitigating it and helping people to have a better chance of surviving it. So with that mission in mind, I want to add to my colleagues' voices here the point that Canada and other countries need to do more to support organizations, non-governmental organizations such as ours, who have developed expertise in this area and are able to help people facing danger tomorrow in the very short term. So while our colleagues at other organizations work at changing and influencing and improving global norms and pushing for a better international cooperation, we want to come in and do more to actually assist the people who are, as I've said, directly in harm's way. And in order to do that, we need resources, and that means investment from the Canadian government. We can't do this alone. The fact is, as I said, we have this expertise that's being developed in Canada and has been recognized internationally, but we're simply not seeing the kind of investment that we need in order to bring it to the kind of life-saving scale and impact that we know it can have. And so that's why we, from the Sentinel Project, add our voice here today to call on Canada to do more, both in its own capacity, but also to call upon its allies and other partners around the world to do more to invest in this kind of work.
And in closing, just want to say that Canada's obligation under the Genocide Convention, its commitment as a signatory of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, demonstrates that Canada has been a leader on the prevention of atrocity crimes, but can do a bit more and can work with allies across the world to prevent these crimes, prevent the displacement, to work early on by using Magnitsky sanctions, travel bans, economic tools, but also looking at when foreign aid and peacekeeping opportunities could actually protect civilians in harm's way. So we thank you for listening to us today, and we remain here to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Okay, we got no question in the room, but we have somebody on Zoom, so we'll go with Dylan.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks. I'm just wondering if you could walk me through Canada's involvement in responsibility to protect in recent years, because I can't really recall any active role that we've done, and I'm having difficulty thinking of things that we funded. It seems like the conflict's been mostly dead in Canada since Libya.
Yeah, I will answer this, and then I'll turn to my colleagues to have to say. I would say that you're right. In Libya, Canada did, with its allies, invoke the response to protect that resulted in air operations against the Gaddafi regime that was about to attack an urban center. Since then, while the response to protect has not explicitly been mentioned in all foreign policy statements, there are many actions that do confirm the response to protect. So Canada naming Bob Rae as a special envoy to Myanmar to deal with the Rohingya crisis, I would see that as a responsibility to protect action. Working to hold Russia to account for atrocity crimes in Ukraine against civilians, I would easily argue that that is part of our response to protect. So why it hasn't specifically been mentioned per se, those actions fall under the umbrella of the response to protect doctrine. But I perhaps would turn to Savita to elaborate on what I've said.
I mean, just building on what Kyle said, Canada's role in also fighting impunity has been really important. I mean, right now, Canada is taking Syria to court at the International Criminal Court for violations of conventions against torture. It is intervening in a case which Gambia is involved in with Myanmar on the violation of the Genocide Convention. So, and also Canada is a big supporter of investigative mechanisms in the UN Human Rights Council. So, I mean, Canada is upholding its responsibility to protect in multiple instances. But what we would like to see is sort of much more consistent and engaged action, not only in terms of country situations, but also in terms of sort of talking about, the importance of atrocity prevention, talking about using the lens of atrocity prevention when it looks at the world. So how is it evaluating its engagement bilaterally with many countries around the world? How is it sort of looking at Myanmar and what can be done further to protect people there? Or in Ethiopia, what can be done on the ground to protect people there? How is it training its foreign service officials to be very cognizant when they're serving in different posts that there might be a risk of atrocity in that particular situation, and what can be done in the short term as well as in long term? As I said earlier, Canada has been a norm entrepreneur around human rights norms and the responsibility to protect. And in the recent years, we have seen Canada shy away from using the terminology of the responsibility to protect. And what you would like to see is more consistent engagement around that.
Thank you. And for my follow-up, I guess you might have already answered this, but I'm wondering if you could characterize this government's approach to atrocities around the world. I mean, you know, when I think about the previous government, some of the messaging was quite clear. Libya is obviously the example there of something more tactical. When I think of this government, you gave a few examples, but, you know, we still haven't quite responded in Haiti. I've heard nothing about Ethiopia and Sudan. You know, Ukraine has a lot of attention for our security interests and diaspora population, but it does seem it's hard to see what's happening, at least in public. I'm not trying to ask a loaded question here, but I guess I'm just wondering, how do you assess this government, especially vis-a-vis the last one?
So I would not be able to answer in particularities about Canadian government response. I mean, my experience is more within the multilateral sphere, and I think that, yes, there is an immense amount of response and sort of consistent support for what is happening in Ukraine, but I don't think that that support has translated in other situations like Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan. So again, I mean, you know, the purpose of us coming here and talking to you is to sort of urge the Canadian government to really think about how it is engaging in these foreign policy issues and on issues where populations are at risk of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, and especially in the countries that you talked about just now, which includes Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan, Yemen. The list, unfortunately, is just ongoing. I mean, we can add around 20 more countries to this list. So one of the purposes for us to come here to meet with the MPs and government officials is to sort of try to convince Canada to be more systematic in how they engage on these issues.
And Dylan, I'll try to answer your question. I think there's a message that we have here is that Canada needs to mobilize allies to work together on this. And we're saying that because Canada alone, its foreign policy alone, will not be able to stop these crimes. I mean, we're seeing these crimes against humanity, mass atrocity crimes occurring across the Sahel in Africa, multiple countries. In Ethiopia, as you rightfully said, Canada's taken a strong position to help the Uyghurs in resettling 10,000, using sanctions against Russian officials for carrying out atrocities in Ukraine. So Canada has been taking action, but there has been some criticism from outside of the government on limited contributions to peacekeeping in Mali, where we've had non-state actors committing atrocity crimes against Malayan civilians. We've seen a spread we've seen Canada take action against non-state groups like ISIS in Iraq and Syria that committed a genocide against Yazidis. They played a contributing role to stop that group, which effectively ended the genocide against Yazidis and other groups. So there are some positive things, but I think the main message is that there are so many crises taking place that they can't be handled by one country alone. So Canada can play a role to revive as we approach the 20th anniversary of the Response to Respect in 2025, that now's the time for Canada to mobilize actors to work in a more coordinated manner at the UN level when the UN Security Council is being held hostage by two countries that are committing atrocities themselves and have the veto power to block any action. So this is why we're here today. This is why there's an opportunity for Canada to show leadership and continue working with its allies to make never again a reality.
If I could add on to that. I'd just like to add that while I personally don't think I can comment on the successes or failures of a given government, as in the party in power, either currently or previously, I would say that a general theme that we've seen with the Canadian government is perhaps there are two themes. One is a lack of long-term commitment to a lot of the places around the world where this kind of work needs to be done. Of course, we do need to have rapid response capability when new crises are arising. That is also lacking. But a lot of these issues, even when acute cases of violence arise, they're born out of long-term issues that require long-term investment in order to prevent them from reaching the level of mass atrocities. And the other theme is often a lack of clarity around our government's priorities in terms of geography. What are the countries that we care about? What are the countries that, implicitly we don't care about? Because as my colleagues have highlighted, there's no shortage of places around the world where this kind of work is needed. And while, of course, we do accept that there are real resource constraints and we can't, just like no person can do everything everywhere, no one government can do everything everywhere, there is indeed a lack of clarity around why we choose to work in the places that we do and engage in the places that we do and not in others. And I can say, though it might be largely anecdotal from my own personal experience, this is not lost on a lot of people in places, in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where the Western, including Canadian, very rapid and massive focus or response to the war in Ukraine is observed. And it's also not lost on people in that part of the world when that comes at the expense of others who need support in places like South Sudan or Congo or the Central African Republic or Burkina Faso or Mali. The list goes on and on. So just to sum up, those are the two themes that I've seen, is the lack of long-term commitment to working in these kinds of places to really make this kind of work meaningful, which goes hand in hand with a lack of rapid response capability when crises do arise, and then also just a lack of clarity around our priorities and how these decisions are made about where we engage and where we don't.
You can go ahead, Dylan, for another question.
Hi there. Sorry to hog up your morning here. But I'm curious about the Indo-Pacific strategy and what's in that document and what we see coming out of it. We've started to see the sanctions on Sri Lanka, about the Tamil conflict. We're seeing not so much in India with the questions around that government's treatment of minorities and some of the historical events that have happened there. You've mentioned the Uyghur situation in China. I'm just curious how you assess what's coming out of the Indo-Pacific strategy, since it is the one region that we seem to be putting out a clear vision of it, although there wasn't a lot on human rights. So, what do you think of what's written and what we've done in the region in recent months?
Having read the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think it gives a guideline for Canada to make this a priority area for Canada to engage from an economic perspective, but also from a security perspective. And written between the lines is an issue about needing to diversify away from China. It isn't specifically mentioned the Uyghurs, but it would be naive to not to think about how the treatment to the Uyghurs, the bellicose rhetoric coming from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the kidnapping of the two Michaels is having changed Canada's view and needing to engage in the Asia-Pacific area with a clear eye. And in that strategy is to engage with allies, find partners, and to work with people with the values that Canada holds, democratic states that want to uphold human rights. So I see this as an important step, and I'm hoping, and I'd be very supportive, that the Asia-Pacific strategy also gives consideration to atrocity crimes. We are seeing them in the area, and we all know that when there's conflict, very often mass atrocity crimes take place under the cover of conflict. So that's why I think Canada can play a role in the Asia-Pacific, looking at seeing where conflict might erupt and ensuring that the crimes outlined in the Rome Statute that remind our allies and others that those are norms, that's international law, and that Canada expects those countries to uphold those laws.
Thank you. And just a question about the rapid response capacity that we're lacking. I'm just wondering if you could maybe in plain language explain, do other countries have, teams that they can just deploy for this type of thing, or what exactly would that actually look like?
I suppose I can comment. Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was talking about rapid response capacity, I was admittedly coming at that from the perspective of somebody who's leading an NGO. And so we need a rapid response sort of mechanism within government to be able to access funds to support our ability to respond rapidly. I can't comment as well on governments and their own personnel and their own teams being available to respond rapidly to these sorts of crises. I do know, and actually perhaps Savita would be better to comment on this, that some other countries have started to make atrocity prevention, broadly speaking, a higher priority and a more specific priority than Canada has, which doesn't necessarily mean that they have, as of right now, a rapid response capacity or capability in that way, but they're much closer to that, I would say, than we are. But if you're willing to take over, I'd let you comment on that.
No, and I think that, more than just a rapid response capacity, I think that, what we have seen, with different genocides and in situations where atrocities and crimes against humanity have been committed, that doesn't happen in a day. So the process of commission of atrocity crimes, it's planned. It involves different kinds of stakeholders. So when we say that Canada has to develop better capacities around atrocity prevention, it means that investing in prevention, investing in long-term prevention, it means that you train your diplomats to understand warning signs, to think in terms of the different tools in the toolbox, from sort of the trade relationships to the trainings, to the support and the development support that Canada provides, how to leverage them well within the bilateral relationships and also within the multilateral forums, to urge governments to treat their populations better, to treat their minorities better, to not commit atrocity crimes. So more than just a rapid response, which Chris talked about in terms of also access to funds, it's about sort of investing in prevention. It's about having a lens of how we protect human rights across the world. Because the fire brigade mentality doesn't always work, because by the time we are able to actually deploy, hundreds of lives have already been lost, millions of people have been displaced. So I think it's very much about looking at prevention as a strategy for implementation. And there are governments who are doing better on this, who have adopted sort of an atrocity prevention perspective within their conflict and stabilization units. So there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of good practice out there, which can be exchanged and incorporated in the Canadian foreign policy. So that's what we hope happens.
If I may just quickly add.
Go ahead.
I'm glad that Savita actually used the fire brigade example, because I'm fond of analogies to try to more effectively express my thoughts. And I think we need both. If we thought of atrocity prevention as fire safety, essentially, we need to do more in terms of prevention. That's the long-term investment and engagement I was talking about. So we need better building codes. We need smoke detectors everywhere, whatever that looks like in an atrocity prevention context. But we also have to accept that fires will still happen. And so we still need the fire brigade. We still need the fire department. And that's essentially my argument here. And as of right now, I don't think that we're doing particularly well on either front. So if we really want to have a holistic, fully capable ability to respond to these things, or prevent and respond to these things and mitigate their impacts when they do happen, hopefully less frequently, we need to have that full spectrum approach to prevention, response, and mitigation.
Do we have another question on Zoom? Okay, this concludes the press conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a glass of water.
Yes.
I do this for the water.